Computer. We're going to get started in about a minute or two. Thank you all for joining. Quite a few people on the Zoom, which is great. Um,
Okay, before we get started, I just wanted to say hello. My name is Casey Reha. I am the president of the Hospitality and Tourism Management Graduate Student Association. We really thank you for your time today to be with us, whether it be virtual or in person. We've really wanted to do this talk for quite a long time now, so we are very excited that we get to have Michael speak with us today. So thank you all for being here.
you. So I think we're going to get started in just a minute. Really?
Yeah, from GSM.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So I think I will get started in just a minute.
Sure.
We're recording this. I'm also doing a separate recording. Hopefully you folks can hear me well and you can see everything pretty well. And yeah, let me get started, make sure that everything is working. And that seems to be the case. So that's great. So I'm Michael Luongo. I'm one of the PhD students here at the Hospitality and Tourism School at Purdue University. I want to definitely thank Casey for inviting me to give this talk, Sarang as well, and really all of you for being here, and especially all of you for being on Zoom. This is a talk that, to be quite frank, I've kind of brought up this as a topic, LGBTQ tourism. Though I'm here looking at tourism redevelopment in the context of conflict, my current research, going back to the 90s, which seems so long ago, and some of you weren't even born at that time yet. But some of my early research for my master's at Rutgers in urban planning was looking at gay tourism, which we would now call LGBTQ tourism. And some of it was quite groundbreaking at the time, but we'll go into a lot of that. Casey had seen my book, Gay Tourism, which came out in 2002. Tom Roth, who was joining us, who's on the Zoom, there's a chapter with him also in this book. This was the first academic book on the gay tourism industry, so an early textbook that came out in 2002. So we'll pass some of these out in a little bit, but let's get started, and I'll let you know what you're going to be hearing, what you're going to be learning in about this 1 hour that we have together. I'm hopefully going to speak for about half an hour, 45 minutes, and then leave time open for question and answer. So I called this Following the Rainbow, LGBTQ plus travel, prepared for the Purdue University School of Hospitality and Tourism, and I'm speaking to you from West Lafayette, Indiana. So what are we going to be discussing today? So right now I actually teach a speech class to the first year students. And so I kind of always go over with them, you've got to kind of lay out what you're going to say. You've got to lay out your credentials. You've got to let people know what to expect during this talk. So I'm going to talk with you a little bit about my background and experience. I'm going to give you some gay or LGBTQ plus tourism history, and some current academic research, and then we'll leave time for Q&A. So some of my background and experience, and most of these are my photos from different prides, different events that I've been to. Again, I'm a PhD student here. I've taught for the tourism school. I'm currently teaching for the communication school. My research looks at tourism in the context of conflict. My dissertation will be focusing on Iraq, Rwanda, and Ukraine. So 3 places in very different states of war or relationships with war. I've been a journalist for over 25 years with a specialty on LGBTQ issues. Through the NLGJ, National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association, 2013 Journalist of the Year. I also head their Travel Writers Caucus, and we used to host fantastic travel writers parties at their conference. did a lot of pioneering academic research on gay tourism beginning in the early 1990s. And I've traveled to more than 100 countries on all 7 continents, which has allowed me to look at different forms of LGBT life, really throughout the world, and sort of, but we'll mostly concentrate on things in the West. These are some of my books and some of my articles and more, primarily mainstream as well as LGBT stuff. I didn't put the logo in for Fun Maps, but that's an important one to point out. I was the communication director for Fun Maps, which was a gay travel map company that would map out gay neighborhoods and gay destinations. And my first job that I had after graduate school, which really helped to also kind of put a lot of the world, the gay world, in perspective. I had done some foundational research on this topic. So in 1996, in the Annals of Tourism Research, ATR, as we like to call it here in the department, with Raya Holcomb, who was technically not my advisor at Rutgers, but she's who I did a lot of research with. We published Gay Tourism in the United States. That was in 1996. And as far as we know, that's the earliest or among the earliest of academic articles on the gay tourism industry. I'm going to use this phrase gay tourism as opposed to LGBTQ tourism, or I'll use these phrases back and forth. Back in the day, these were the things that we used to call it. I had also been a researcher at Canterbury Christ Church College, which is teaching college of the Church of England. We had done a lot on HIV and tourism. I published my master's thesis, which was actually looking at commercial sex venues and male escorts used by gay tourists in New York City. That was my thesis. But was also looking at some of the research that we've done at Canterbury. That was all at Rutgers, that degree. And then in 2002, in the Gay and Lesbian Quarterly, I published an academic piece. Again, these are peer-reviewed. Chapter wouldn't be peer-reviewed technically, but peer-reviewed articles and quite foundational articles on the LGBT travel industry. World Pride in Rome was the first World Pride. We're going to look a little bit more at other World Prides, but it was an analysis of the challenges, the economics of it, and how it actually transformed gay tourism in Rome as well. These are some of my books, articles, and more. One of the things I do want to point out to people, so again, we already talked about the academic book. I was an editor at Hayworth Press, and I edited a collection series of books called Out in the World. The company was bought out, but some of the books are still published. Gay Travels in the Muslim World was one of the books. It's the first gay American book that was ever translated and published into Arabic. I don't have the English language copy for some reason. I loaned it to people and I don't know where it is, but I do have some of that. Looking for Love in Faraway Places is another book that we published from that series. This was from before same-sex marriage was sort of became the law of the land in the United States and certainly other countries around the world. It's my novel, The Voyeur, which is based on my time as an HIV researcher in New York. And also my Argentina, my Frommer's books for Argentina and Buenos Aires. What I always point out to people is that people know me from particular silos. So they know me from the LGBT work, they know me from the creative writing, they know me from the Latin America writing, or they know me from the Middle East writing, but they don't always know that this is the same person. And I know that this also confuses people when there's a variety of different things that you write on. I'll just pass these around so you can take a look at them as well. I've also been on TV talking about LGBT travel, some of the challenges. I did give a human rights talk on LGBT issues for the history department on Tuesday. One of the things that I emphasized in this is that while that was focused on the so-called global South and its relationship with the global North, we have a lot of issues in the United States where gay travel, LGBT travel is concerned. Florida is probably become one of the most anti-LGBT states that we have, and yet it's an important travel destination for gay people. Miami Beach, Fort Lauderdale, all of these locations. And so I was on talking about this sort of issue that Canada had issued warnings for its citizens to avoid traveling to certain parts of the United States without stating where they were talking about. But in general, we know they were talking about Florida, Texas, places where laws are tightening and becoming problematic. I want to talk with you a little bit about terminology. So LGBTQI plus, gay, queer, etc. pronouns. I forgot to say my pronouns. I'm a bad gay person. I use he and him. I'm a cisgender male, but it's one of those things that I always forget. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, T for trans, transgender, never transsexual, queer, sometimes questioning, I for intersex. And again, sometimes we use a variety of different ways of phrasing this. It just comes out of my mouth more easy to just say gay, especially when I say gay tours. But again, when we get to Q&A, there's no wrong questions. I do want to point that out. So let's look a little bit at tourism history and an overview. I think with almost anything related to travel, we cannot connect the history from why people travel to certain destinations or why travel patterns have developed in the way that they have. So we'll look at this a little bit historically. This is something from when 25th anniversary, which is going back a bit now, 30 years, I guess, at this point, roughly 30 years. And this was when New York was preparing for the 25th anniversary of the Stonewall riots, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And this phrasing that the New York Times has about Christopher Street is really important, that it's a gay mecca. And that one of the things about these locations is that they become pilgrimage sites. And LGBT travel in many ways resembles diaspora travel. So where different ethnic groups come to sort of like Italians might go to Little Italy, et cetera, et cetera. Chinese people might go to Chinatown. Gay people flock to certain parts of cities because of that. So in many ways, it resembles a religious pilgrimage. What I also want to point out that's interesting is that since this is 1993, 31 years ago at this point, most of the stores here that are interviewed, they don't exist anymore on Christopher Street. So this is also part of the gentrification and the transformation that comes out of cities. So this is an LGBTQI tourism market overview. This is sort of old data. Tom had given me some new data, which I didn't have time to kind of put on. This is some data that I had that was really for COVID, but also looking at some comparisons from 1995. This was from Out Now Consulting. And again, pre-COVID data, and Tom has more newer data to talk more about community marketing in a little bit as well. So the dollar value at that time of gay travel was 63.1 billion worldwide, 218 in the US was 63.1 billion, worldwide was 218 billion. When Brian and I had done that article back in 1995, published in 96, the data that we had was 10 billion. So the market has grown tremendously, but I also think that from the point of view of how we tag things and how we do research, we're also capturing things that we weren't able to capture 30 years. And so the US is a top destination, Brazil, Japan, Germany, UK, France, Mexico, Italy, Canada, Spain, Australia, towards the end there. These are many places that are popular to begin with. There are also places that have large LGBT communities and sites related to them. One thing that is really important to think about in terms of gay travel, and we talked a lot about this when I did this early research in the 90s, is the relationship between LGBT travel and identity. And so it's a few different things. LGBT historic sites like the Stonewall Inn, Castro Street, San Francisco. So you want to go to historic sites the way anybody would want to go to historic sites. What is very different though, is this idea of being in the company of others who are like you. I used to write also for, again, a magazine that doesn't exist, Our World, which was based in Florida at the time and went defunct sometime after 9/11. And the publisher would tell me that most of the people that subscribed are not from big cities, but from small locations, what we would now call red states. And it was really because they accessed that publication, again, largely pre-web. They would access that publication so that they would know where to go and where to find people like themselves in a way that they couldn't be at that time at home. So that's, I think, one thing that is very key. A phrase that we used to use a lot in terms of tourism research at this time was also the tourist gaze. So there's this idea of you go to locations and they're going to resemble something that you they look a certain way and resemble a certain thing to you. But we don't really talk about tourist gaze and that kind of research that much anymore. Some other things about LGBTQ tourism market overview. The values differ depending on how they're gathered. Statistics are often not comparative. A lot of early research comes out of gay, white, middle-class men. Some of the early surveys that community marketing had, for example, you required a passport. And now it's that most people have passports, but it's not required to be part of that. So one of the things that I think is really important is when we look at early data or we look at how this data is gathered, and data on LGBTQ people is very difficult to gather. And usually the people that do participate in surveys are those who are at least risk for participating in surveys. We know this from other surveys that we participate in. So they can be skewed more to people like me, gay, white, middle-class men. I think if I were to pull up a lot of what community marketing does now, the surveys are extremely diverse. They capture women, they capture minorities, they capture things in a way that wasn't in a lot of early research. So we as academics have to understand the data and question methodology. We used to consider LGBT tourism in terms of marketing strength. It was once considered recession-proof. There's this phrase, which really kind of comes out of late 1970s, 1980s, yuppie culture, this idea of dinks, double income, no kids, which really applied a lot to the LGBT community. Now people get married and they have kids, so that's changed everything a lot. But there was also this idea that because you didn't have kids, you had a higher propensity to travel, and that was really true. Statistically considered higher income, that was in particular for male couples. For women couples, it's a little bit different. And in 1993, when Brian and I had originally been doing this research, gay couples averaged 4.5 major trips per year versus about 1 for straight couples. Looking at some of the newer research today, some of those numbers are roughly the same still. What is changing? Marriage, honeymoons, all these things have transformed LGBT tourism. That's a picture from the Out Games, which doesn't exist anymore. That's now the Gay Games. There were 2 competing forms of Gay Olympics, which we're not supposed to say that word because the Olympics regards that as an infringement, but that's sort of how people think of them. Some more origins of LGBTQI travel. We're really going back to the late Victorian period when the word homosexual was actually coined. Now, we often think that these are not places where somebody would necessarily find freedom, the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Very often people from the northern parts of Europe would travel to the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Names you would know are Oscar Wilde, Baron Wilhelm von Boden, Thomas Mann, who's famous for Death in Venice, as an example. And in Germany, in the early 1900s, there was actually research from Hirschfeld. A lot of that research in person was destroyed by the Nazis. So you begin to see this idea of communities forming, very often well-to-do men who've had a lot of mobility. Then as we move into the 20th century, we see the Harlem Renaissance. As important, Christopher Isherwood in Berlin, which is cabaret is based on. The United States also had Pansy Film in the 1830s, played on some of these phenomena before the Hayes rules. The books that really look at this primarily focused on New York. Of course, New York is this enormous center where a lot of this was developed. There's The Gay Metropolis by Charles Kaiser and Gay New York by Chauncey. Let's look a little bit more about what began to develop. And the neighborhoods that we think of as LGBT neighborhoods, gay neighborhoods, began to really develop and become visible in the United States because of World War II. So I crossed out this because of that famous phrase, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? But now we're talking about San Diego, talking about New York, talking about Los Angeles, Chicago, San Francisco, Miami Beach. These are where the boats left for both the Pacific Theater and the Atlantic Theater. And so many gay men and lesbians saw what existed in those cities and decided they're not going to go home. We also have all those other issues, particularly in the 60s and 70s, of white flight, the emptying out of neighborhoods, social conflict, civil rights movement, which also created changes within urban spaces that made them cheaper and easier for some people to live in as well. The other thing I want to point out, which is important, are the satellite centers. These are generally places of travel that are near big cities, but they're more in what we might call exurbia rather than suburbia. So Fire Island, which is a remote, wonderful place to go to. Asbury Park, which is near where I grew up in the suburbs and on the Jersey Shore. Provincetown, Laguna Beach, which is about an hour and a half south of Los Angeles. Provincetown is on the very edge of Cape Cod. Key West, which is about as far south as you can go in the United States. I also want to point out Rehoboth, which is popular particularly among DC gays and Philadelphia gays, and it's where the Bidens have their vacation home. And so you don't have to be gay to be in Rehoboth, but I think it also states something if that's where they have their vacation home as well, in a place that's known as space. Again, then the growth of these neighborhoods that you're familiar with, West Hollywood in Los Angeles, Greenwich Village, which really is much older, the Castro in San Francisco, Halsted, South Beach, and locally, though it's not as gay as it used to be, and I've done book events, a book event on Massachusetts Avenue for a bookstore that no longer exists, but I've heard a new bookstore has opened. But that was the gay district in Indianapolis. And I think it's kind of near the bottle factory that's been converted into apartments. So it's become one of those hipster neighborhoods and everything. I do want to point this out. This is in Halsted in Chicago. Some of us call it Boys Town, Halsted. It's the gay district. But like anything, by the time you label it and mark it, it has already transformed. So Halsted, from when these were put up, has also vastly transformed, changed, gentrified. And so these neighborhoods also are somewhat nebulous and transform over time as neighborhoods always do these urban centers. The origin of LGBTQ pride travel parades is the Stonewall Inn. It was a mafia-owned space. There was the rebellion. And this is one of a very good book on that, David Carter's, which has also been made into a documentary. So these are the riots that sparked the gay revolution. And this is why June is Pride Month all around the world. And why even in places that don't know what Stonewall is, it's called the Stonewall. And in Germany, they also call it Christopher Street Day, because that was the street that was. So from New York, and these are some images mostly from New York, but also from across the globe, this has spread around the world, this idea of pride. And so it's probably the largest event in cities that people associate with the LGBT community, but they also drive a lot of tourism in a lot of different ways. For June, for that month, this is often marketed by cities in that way, but there are also things like World Pride, Euro Pride, and other sort of special prides that also drive tours. And so most of these pictures were from Stonewall 50 in 2019. This is Buenos Aires. Intriguingly, we'll talk a little bit more about this same sex. This cathedral was Bergoglio's, who's now the Pope, who was very against same-sex marriage when he was the Cardinal, the Archbishop. But it won, and this was the first pride after the same-sex marriage law was signed. And so LGBTQI travel, in some cases, is the largest tourism event in particular countries. So annually, Sydney's Mardi Gras is Australia's largest tourism event. And the largest pride parade in the world, people often say New York, San Francisco, London, Paris, it's Sao Paulo, Brazil. And this itself has a very interesting origin. There's something like 3.5 million people that come to this. It was a very small pride that was also very dangerous for many people to go to. But ultimately, if we look at Brazil, if you know Brazil, Rio de Janeiro is the place that's really known for celebration, for fun events and things. And Sao Paulo didn't really have that. So ultimately, what Sao Paulo did was to embrace gay pride. And those millions of people, most of them are straight people that come to that. But this is a way in which they get something real like, Carnival like, or New Year's Eve like, that isn't something that they normally would have in Sao Paulo. And it makes it a little bit real like. This is the main neighborhood in Darlinghurst is the main neighborhood in Sydney. Sydney recently hosted World Pride. I wound up going to Sydney just after World Pride had ended. And we've done some articles on the impact. Same-sex marriage. There's an interesting story behind some of these photos. This is in 2015. Canada was having this same-sex marriage event because the United States did not yet have same-sex marriage. Canada had promoted the idea that you could get married, have your honeymoon, and the sense of progress that Canada had versus the United States. And so we were at an event, which was supposed to be about tourism to Canada because of same-sex marriage. And then at that press conference, it was announced the law had passed, that we suddenly had same-sex marriage in the United States. So all of us once, including, I don't remember her name, the drag queen who was part of the event, the Canada event. This is one of the owners of Stonewall. These are just two random men that wanted to kiss to celebrate same-sex marriage being passed. And then that's the pride a little bit later in front of the Stonewall Inn. So, one of the things about same-sex marriage is that it can identify a location as progressive. It can show that it's ahead of other countries. So it becomes part of tourism, but it also becomes a way of saying, we are important for human rights. We're advanced, we're different from the other locations around us. I do want to point out this is particularly the case for Taiwan. Now, Taiwan is the country of honor. Still have, because I'm a hoarder, I just have everything. This is some of the material based on the movie The Wedding Banquet, if you're familiar with that Taiwan had a pop-up for Stonewall 50. It was the country of honor at Stonewall 50 because they had just passed same-sex marriage. And so they heavily promoted Taiwan for the change in the law, for tourism, but also if Taiwan had same-sex marriage and geopolitically, there's a certain challenge for Taiwan. It was also showing that it was more advanced than mainland China by having this law. So it also became part of the geopolitics globally for Taiwan to explain it's a democracy, it values freedom, including for its LGBTQ. Again, this is Buenos Aires, Argentina, 2010. They actually been at the signing of the law in the Casa Rosada. And then this is the Pride Parade, which for Buenos Aires takes place in October, because October is like June for them, because their LGBT movement was born in October. And so that's why it's that. Plus, the weather is different on the other side. So some things about marketing and human rights progress. There's increasingly corporate involvement. This is a constant debate for prides. New York now has 2 prides. Because of this corporate involvement, this idea that should corporations be involved, should they not be involved? Companies doing, sort of rainbow washing things, but they still don't engage in human rights aspects. But I also think there's this normalization in the travel industry, what I often call the 2 beds question. And it used to be that if 2 men in particular, for women, it was a little bit different. We have 1 bed reserved for you. Are you sure you don't want 2 beds? And this used to be a sort of point of conflict sometimes. Like, what do we tell them? We have to come out as a gay couple if we announce that we want 1 bed. So this has been part of sensitivity training as well for many chains. It used to be very easy when it was small boutique gay-owned hotels, but as this expands in a corporate atmosphere, this is the kind of thing that we talk with our students about. Dr. Gordon, for example, has the DEI and hospitality course, and I've done a presentation also with the LGBTQ Center for them. These are some of the things to think about. But is there also, and this is something that I've written about both for the Washington Post and the San Francisco Chronicle, do people want foreign paid dollars over LGBT rights progress. And so this can be a question where they want the money from outside, but they don't want to give rights to people locally. This is often a question with African safari marketing, which can be marketed to LGBT couples, and yet there are horrific human rights issues for LGBTs within certain countries in Africa. One of the things that I always found ironic, though, Peru and Lima have changed drastically in 20-something years. IGLTA, the International Gay and Lesbian Travel Association, had a symposium in Lima, was feted by the Lima government for being there. And then a few months later, the Lima government denied the right for LGBTs to march in a pride parade. And this shows you very clearly this sort of contrast. These are questions that we as academics have to think about when we look at LGBT travel and other issues. So again, the thing that I would say is, one of the things that is coming up is World Pride. And World Pride, and I think this will be very interesting because of the change in the government in the United States right now. So Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, was picked as the World Pride city a few years ago, actually, because all this has to be done a few years before. I have been somebody who's been very critical of World Pride in the way that it is now, because I'm one of the few journalists who's covered both Rome's World Pride, the very first one. Rome's World Pride, and this is a picture from 2013, but Ima Battaglia was one of the organizers of it in 2000. It was a challenge to the Catholic Church. It was the Jubileo, and we have another one coming up, 2025 Years of Christ. Then it was the millennium, it was 2000 years of Christ, a huge event. All of these pilgrims would be coming to Rome. And the Roman activist, the Italian activist said, this is the perfect time to challenge the church as a source of homophobia. And so that was the very first one. It was dangerous and difficult for them to put on. The second one was in Jerusalem. And if you thought that Rome was difficult, the one in Jerusalem originally was 2005. That was when Gaza, the pullout had been from Gaza, so it had to be postponed to 2006. Then it wasn't just challenging Christianity, it was challenging Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And again, it was a very dangerous, difficult pride. There was also a war with Lebanon at the time. But the Israelis called it July War in 2006. It was a very difficult time. The third pride, the talk had been of it being in Istanbul, so that it would be in an Islamic city, but ultimately that's not what happened. And so World Pride began to only be in cities where that had already advanced in LGBT rights, where it was in many ways easy, or maybe not easy, but easier to be gay, where a lot of marketing is done to gay tourists, where you wouldn't have the problems you'd have in Rome and Jerusalem. And in many ways, I kind of find that, well, it's not doing the challenge that it was born to do. So there's this argument that you would have things like the human rights conferences, where it'd be easier to bring people from the developing world, from the global south, to these places, and it would be safe to do so. I'm really, really curious with the change in our government. And again, I never want anybody to think that, oh, we're in the West, we're in the United States, and we have all these human rights. It's a wave and things can be given and then taken away. So I'm really curious, and I think that this would be a world pride that again is a challenge to the religious rights and the homophobia that comes from religion with the new government. If you also want to point out the gay games, this had been postponed. I actually intended to go. When I lived in Hong Kong, I had gone to a lot of the events planning this. COVID got in the way. The tightening of things by the Beijing government had also gotten in the way. So this still happened, but it was much, much smaller than it could have than it had been planned to be. So you can plan a lot of these events. They become victims or pawns, or they're part of the whole geopolitical movement for LGBT rights in the New Orleans. Indiana local, some things that I want to kind of point out. That's me in a big mural of James Dean. I was at the Fairmont James Dean Festival. And I will say that the museum sort of downplays this idea that was he bisexual, was he gay, was Elizabeth Taylor his girlfriend, which is almost silly to think about. But there is also the James Dean Gallery owned by a gay couple that has a lot more of this. Cole Porter, a famous Broadway writer, again, he'd been married, but it was a sort of marriage of convenience, you can say, in his childhood home in Peru. There had also been talk a long time ago when LGBT sports events were one of the things that cities were chasing, that Indianapolis as a major sports center would be a logical place for many LGBT sporting events. So I remember that as a conversation years ago. I don't really know what came of it. But that's just an interesting thing to kind of point out. Let's look a little bit at other academic and marketing research. So again, some LGBTQI travel groups that I want to point out to you. IGLTA, International Lesbian and Gay Travel Association, based in Fort Lauderdale. So again, we've talked about Florida being this difficult state, and yet Fort Lauderdale is this important LGBT center. Their LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce is the national one, and a lot of local ones that are also involved in tourism. Community marketing, CMI.com or CMI.org, where Tom Roth, who is listening in, is from. This is quite an old organization. It's more than, they've been doing research since the early 90s. So they've been doing a lot of research for quite a long time. There's Out and Out Consulting, Pink Media, which is Matt Skellerud, Whittick Communications, Bob Whittick. So a lot of places they're looking at other issues within the LGBT community, other aspects of business, immigration, a whole bunch of statistics and data. So these would be very important sources if you were to look at this. There's other academic and marketing research. The thing that I want to point out is that when Brian and I were doing this stuff in the early 90s, this idea of queer studies as a division in his departments that didn't exist at that time. And in fact, our research was sort of meant in the early 90s to sort of be on the tail of feminist research in particular, particularly where feminism and geography kind of came into play. So all these queer studies things just didn't exist. So there's a lot more stuff now than there used to be. A friend of mine, been my editor, and I've known him again decades, Ed Salvato, who also teaches at NYU's Tisch School, the tourism school there. It's a book that he had done, the Handbook of LGBT Tourism and Hospitality. Co-edited that with Jeff Guaracino. Jeff unfortunately passed a few years ago, but was another major pioneer in terms of LGBT tourism. Another book, Gordon Waite and Kevin Markwell, on gay tourism. This is kind of a funny title. Jerry McCormick is also at NYU, but he kind of looks at, again, with this idea of the tourist gaze, you're going to a place like Lebanon, other parts of the Middle East, this idea of the hairy bear that you are looking at, and whether or not we orientalize some of this or exoticize this. Carlos Monterrubio is somebody who is very, very prolific. I've actually used aspects of this tourist motivations, lesbian motivations for Mexico to look at my own motivations within the tourism and conflict, because some of the qualitative questions that he asks for research that is new, that is hard to get at, it's a really good model for that. So a lot of other people who are doing this grinder tourism, travel motives, identity and travel in Australia. So I also want to point out that how much gay tourism has changed over time. So this is academia.edu, which I think we all are posted on and kind of find our own things on, communicate with other researchers on. So if I just put in gay tourism, and I really think that in the 1930s to the 1950s, gay meant happy, not quite the way that it was. So because you do have some articles about gay tourism in the earlier part of the last century, but then you see how much it just balloons, this kind of stuff. This is roughly around the time that Brian and I had published that. So, but I think what's important, and I think to recommend this, particularly for the young PhD students who are new to research, is this idea of foundational research, if you can do that. So the article that Brian and I had was going on 30 years ago, but almost everyone who refers to or writes on gay tourism refers in some way to the work that she and I have done. They also refer to the work that Stephen Clift and Carrie Callister and I had done, that book, Gay Tourism Identity, Culture, Identity, and Sex, that we had done. So this is the front page, the very first page, like the Google front page.
Awesome video.
We're not the number one, but we're number 5 and number 6. This is an article about the book, and this is the book. So this shows the importance of, in your own research, trying to do foundational research if you can. We all know that we want people to refer to us. And so 30 years on, 25 years on, some of this foundational work is still referred to and remains on the top page. But again, I think just how much the mix between marketing, human rights, advances in LGBT issues, and how this kind of comes into play shows just how much it's impacted what you see out in the world and what you also see in terms of academic research. And so what does the future hold for us as researchers? Those of you who are marketers, those of you who are just interested in travel. I think that some of the issues that would be important to us are travel and identity, which I talked about in the very beginning, and how much going to a gay space, particularly for those who don't have that at home, how important that is. The genuine intertwiner impact on human rights, issues within marketing, the impact of LGBTQ plus tourism in the developing world, again, that global north, global south, and intersectionality and co-marginalized groups. And I think there's a lot more research on that now. There's a blogger, I'm gonna blank on his name, but you know, he is in a wheelchair, but he's also gay, and so he blogs on a variety of different issues from different perspectives. The experiences of somebody who's transgender is very different from my experiences. Somebody who's of a different ethnic group, traveling to another part of the world, that's very different. I would also wonder what the current conflicts and the impact on mobility are doing to gay travel, to gay tourism. These are pictures from 2015. This is in Latvia, Riga, Latvia. This is the Europride. It was the first time that Europride was on Soviet soil. It had been in Eastern Europe because it had been in Poland, but it was the first time that it was on soil that had been part of the USSR. During this time, now this is after the Crimea was taken from Ukraine. This was very problematic for a variety of reasons, but during this event, Russia had lined up tanks on the Latvian border. So this threat and this idea that we're in a war, this 2.5-year war that has been over more than 2.5 years in Ukraine, we've got the war in Gaza and Israel as well. You know, what impact do these have on LGBT communities? We know that very often war gives power to the religious right as well. So these are other aspects of this. When I gave that talk on human rights and LGBT refugees, LGBT people are particularly vulnerable in a war as well. So those are sort of what I would say for young researchers or people who are interested in this. And that's really it. So, you know, again, that's a happier picture in Latvia as well. Love that mustache. So that's it. We've spoken for about 40 minutes or so. We still have almost 15 minutes for questions. So, you know, I appreciate all of you being here. And, you know, I don't really have anybody monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, I would say to just, you know, if you're on Zoom, just open up your microphone and ask, and I'll repeat it. But, you know, thank you all. Thank you all. Well, these are local Dora, as in our LGBT things, the Dora Hotel Company. And I don't know if they're the same from the Dora our auditorium because there's two Dora families. But this is some of their LGBT stuff that they had given out at our hospitality summit. So,
Thank you, Michael.
sure, Dr. Sai.
It's very informative, but also very motivating talk.
Mhm.
The question about the books you produced in your early days, did you, right? Which is the latest edition of the guidebook to Argentina?
So these are older books. So the issue with my Frommer's books is that they all date now back to 2011, 2012.
So that collector's item.
They're collected, actually, I mean, I'm surprised sometimes when I go on Amazon what people,
So Argentina was one of the popular destinations.
yeah.
For the LGBTQ population, but the country has changed dramatically.
Yes, yeah, that's another thing to kind of, that I brought up.
So you didn't mention geopolitical shift, but the country has shifted.
Yes,
They elected one of the Donald Trump's fans.
Yeah.
And he is right now in Florida, right? Meeting with Donald
meeting
Trump.
with Donald Trump, yeah.
So this would be interesting inquiry to look into the change in mobility, the change in travel patterns of this particular market segment.
That would be interesting. Do you mean academically or journalistically or in some either way? If
On both, right?
Yeah.
But academically, this will be interesting as well. I mean, if you could map the mobility patterns of any market sector, in this case, that would be interesting. That would
Yeah.
be a valuable record we have.
Yeah,
You know, if we're interested in tracking human migration,
Yeah.
there is a particular subpopulation
yeah.
that it's in travel domain.
Well, I think that people choose, this is one of the things in terms of this issue with Florida. And this worry that, the restrictions on LGBT, banning of books. You can't talk about transgenders in school, this idea that this is gonna stop people from traveling to a particular location. Now with Argentina, that's a really good question, because I think at one point, so the maximum, the highest number of American tourists at one time, I think was 400,000.
Yeah.
And of that was estimated to be about 8 to 10%.
On November 6th,
Yeah,
2000% more people with the inquiry about going to Canada, Australia, right?
yeah,
It'll be interesting to see how many of these inquiries about emigrating to other countries are from particular segments of the population. My hypothesis is there will be a lot of people,
yeah,
proportionally more people who are in this population, the population of your talk, look at where this country is headed, at least in the next 4 years, right?
yeah,
So I think you brought up the geopolitical issues. I think that's something we, as a research community, we try to avoid it, to tackle, because it involves all other disciplines, sociology, psychology, But this is something we can pursue.
yeah, that's an interesting.
I mean, even Taiwan, right?
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, in 2019, when you collected all these items, and there was the same party, political party, that is the ruled Taiwan at that time, but the same party right now. But even the same party, they have different
yeah,
attitude toward social economy.
yeah. That's a very good progress. He got rid of in Argentina, Javier Milei, got rid of INADI, which was the diversity group. New York Times recently had a whole thing on, women's sexual health, all the money that was lost from that.
So it'll be difficult
Yeah,
time for folks in this market segment population, the president-elect has all the power he has right now, right? House, Senate, and the court and himself, right? So will be tough fight, but fight with you.
Yeah,
But that's what it's.
yeah, that's a good.
No, I don't want to dominate this, but you might want to check the chat.
Yeah, let me see if anybody is in. You're gonna see my big face coming at you.
Question.
Sure, let me just see what's in the chat. Oh, Cherry Grove, yeah, from Andres Fagundes, yeah. So no real quiet, but I'll read all of that in a little bit too. But yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah. I think culture can be bigger when others
Yeah,
are joined. So for example, like this LGBTQ plus tourism,
Mhm.
I think like parades or festivals can be bigger when straight people
oh, yeah,
are
yeah, yeah,
joined.
yeah.
But do you think they prefer to be themselves so that they can maintain their identity, or they still want others to join? And if it's the second case, like if they want others to join, what would be the strategy they can attract people who have negative perceptions about the LGBTQ?
Well, I mean, I think this is a bit of a dilemma, to kind of step back a little bit from that question. This was one of the issues of, bachelorette parties in gay bars. Personally, I think, you know, if straight people want to come into your spaces, that's a good thing. You know, personally, that's my view. I think this was also, though, part of the corporatization of Pride, this idea that it had to be perhaps less festive, perhaps less risque, for want of a better word, because of the corporate market, because more children were coming, because more straight people were coming. So there is that as an issue. I do know, and this is, you know, the Buenos Aires parade was a night parade, and it was a night parade because then people couldn't see you marching down the Avenida de Mayo. I do know there was, you know, I remember this very well. She was a friend of mine that I'd known since grade school, photographing her at Gay Pride. Because she was marching and it was part of the LGBT synagogue, gay synagogue. And she's like, you cannot use those pictures, you cannot use those pictures. And now she doesn't mind if I use, so even that's a straight person, a gay person who's worried that she'll be identified in the media. I don't know the real answer to that. My personal view is the more the merrier. And when, you know, when you do see people bringing their children and their children are waving, like, those are gonna be really good kids when they grow up, you know? So, but I know in the Castro in San Francisco, and Halloween is a very gay event in both in New York and in San Francisco, there were people coming to beat up gay people, or at least start fights in the Castro. And I think for a while, Castro stopped having its Halloween event because of that. So, you know, I learned this actually when I was in Michigan, about Dearborn, which is an Arab and Muslim center, which is featured a lot into the current elections, but that there's a kind of tourism which is hatred tourism, where people go to these centers that are known for gay people, Jewish people, Muslim people, somebody who's different, and they go to start problems. And it's a topic we talked about at the University of Michigan in terms of the kind of tourism you don't want when you become visible as a center. So that's an interesting, you know, there's many aspects to it. So,
Thank you.
anyone else have questions or still have a few minutes? Did
Hey,
anybody in the Zoom audience? Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. So you mentioned that same-sex male couples make more money than same-sex women couples. Do you think that's just because of the pay grade, or does that have to do with sexuality?
So there's a variety of reasons for this. I would also argue that despite a lot of the marketing efforts, a lot of gay men, because of discrimination, maybe don't earn as much as straight men, or may be more likely to be in quote unquote pink collar activities that may pay less. And so very often two gay men together don't make as much as if two straight men were together. Women in general, I don't know the exact percentage, what is it, 70 cents on the dollar, 80 cents on the dollar. There's that date where the dollar for a woman matches the dollar of the man. So I think it's because of the historical issues for women in work, which, you know, there are men who argue, well, women purposely choose, you know, some, I think more of the men in power now would be arguing that women purposely choose lower paying work. Some men argue that. There's also the issue of healthcare, childcare falling more on the woman, even if you think you're a very egalitarian couple, as a male and female couple, it's usually the woman who steps aside and works less. And so I think it's because of historical, it's our society. I'm going to blame our society. It's our social structure, which means that in general, women earn less. And so two women would earn less than two men, though there's some research that shows that that's not necessarily true, that women who don't have children will be more career driven. So the data on a lot of that is murky, but I think in general, women as a whole are less visible within the LGBTQ travel space. And in general, women do statistically make less than men. But within the LGBTQ spectrum, it can be a little bit more murky for a variety of reasons. Hopefully that answers, or sort of answers, the question. Thanks. Anyone else in the Zoom audience have a question? All right, I guess I could end it. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. And yeah, all right.
Yes, we have a photo taken with you.
Yeah.
The ladies, and we have.
Do you want to take
My
a picture of us?
first?
Yeah. All right. Should I close you folks out?
Close.
Do you folks want to still stay online a bit? Or I'd also say, let me just say to everybody, if they had questions for me, you can email me here at Purdue. Email me any questions that you might have. And let me see. Yeah. And Andres, I have been to Fire Island, but I have not been to Fire Island in this millennium, this century. It's a long time ago. I haven't been since the 90s. So hopefully I will be there.
The officers, right?
Right.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Right, thank you, Michael. We really
All right.
appreciate it.
Thank you, Casey. I think I'm going to close this out now.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. All right. Thank you again. Bye.
No, switch.
All right. So how do I close this out? And
Just do this.
that's your end meeting.